We're building something special here, and we need your help to get to 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe before you go. A single tube of blood sits in a centrifuge in a university laboratory in Rome. It is one of dozens collected for a routine forensic identification project. Nothing exotic, nothing designed to answer questions about ancestry at all. The technician running the panel is calibrating a DNA identification kit, the kind used in paternity cases and criminal casework, checking basic allele markers that show up in almost every human population on Earth. Then one sample returns something that doesn't belong. A maternal line marker, a signature carried only through the mother's line, generation after generation, that statistically has almost no business appearing in Central Africa. It's a lineage more commonly tracked across South Asia, thousands of miles and, by most models, thousands of years removed from where this sample was drawn. No one flags it publicly, not for years. It sits in a dataset, unpublished, referenced only once, briefly, by another research team working on something else entirely. The person this sample came from belonged to a group whose origin story, where they came from, who they actually are, whether they arrived as outsiders or grew up on this land like everyone else, had already been, for a full century, the single most dangerous question in the country's history. Colonial administrators had fought over that question with calipers and height charts. Geneticists had fought over it with blood panels. The people themselves had fought over it, and died over it, in numbers that are hard to say out loud. One overlooked lab result reopens the entire argument. If one blood sample from Central Africa carries a genetic signature more at home in South Asia, what does that actually prove? And just as importantly, what does it not? Officially today, the story is simple. Everyone here came from the same place. Since 1994, Rwanda's government has recognized a single legal nationality, Rwandan, with no official ethnic categories on paper. That's the modern position, and it's a deliberate one. But for most of the 20th century, and for centuries before that, the population was understood in three parts. Hutu, somewhere around 84 to 85% by pre-2017 CIA World Factbook estimates. Tutsi, roughly 14 to 15%. And Twa, about 1%. Three names, three labels, one country. Here's what modern genetics says about where those labels came from. Y chromosome studies, tracking male lineage passed down father to son, like a name that never changes, suggest Hutu paternal ancestry is overwhelmingly Bantu in origin. Around 83% of Hutu male lineages fall into haplogroup E1b1a, with another 8% in E2. Both signatures tied to the Bantu expansion, the millennia-long spread of farming peoples and their languages across Central and Southern Africa. A small residue, about 3% E1b1b, 1% R1b, traces to the Horn of Africa and North Africa, chalked up to earlier populations absorbed long before anyone was counting. And the official consensus doesn't stop with Hutu ancestry. Tutsi populations are also described, in the same body of research, as predominantly Bantu in origin. Same expansion, same deep roots. The Twa, meanwhile, are something older still, a forest-dwelling population tied to the wider Central African hunter-gatherer lineages that anthropologists sometimes group under the term pygmy populations, predating the Bantu farmers by a wide margin. That specific genetic picture for the Twa is thinner in the literature than the other two. Researchers themselves are candid that more sampling is needed before drawing firm lines. Linguistically, there is no daylight at all. Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa all speak Kinyarwanda. Same religion, same festivals, same funerals, same weddings. For centuries, the boundary between Hutu and Tutsi wasn't even fixed at birth. It moved. A Hutu man who acquired enough cattle could become Tutsi, a process with its own name, Kwihutura. A Tutsi family that lost its herds could, over a generation, become Hutu. Status moved. Bloodline, in the traditional telling, did not. Put those pieces together and you get a tidy, reassuring story. One Bantu-rooted population, one language, one culture, with Hutu and Tutsi functioning historically more like class labels, cattle owner versus farmer, than like separate bloodlines at all. Genetic studies broadly back this up, describing the two groups as sharing close genetic kinship, with differences researchers characterize as comparatively minor. But if that's the whole truth, if this was always one genetic population wearing two social labels, then a long list of physical and biological differences that researchers kept measuring, decade after decade, for over 100 years, shouldn't exist at all. They do. Here is where it gets complicated. Go back to that vial in Rome. The data behind it is real, and it's published. A 2004 paper in the journal Forensic Science International, titled, plainly, Allele Distribution of 15 PCR-based loci in the Rwandan Population, built from 52 Hutu samples collected at a Catholic parish in Nyarurema and 63 Tutsi samples from central Rwanda, processed at the Catholic University of Rome's Laboratory of Forensic Hematology. Straightforward forensic science. Nothing sensational in the methodology. The sensational part comes from a separate 2009 paper by Fornarino and colleagues, which reported, cautiously, in passing, as unpublished supplementary data, that one Tutsi individual sampled from Rwanda carried mitochondrial haplogroup R7. Mitochondrial DNA is the genetic material passed down strictly along the maternal line, mother to daughter, largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Think of it as a single, unbroken phone line running back through every mother you've ever had. Haplogroup R7 is a branch on that line that shows up overwhelmingly in South Asia. One sample, one person. Researchers are careful to frame this as an anomaly, not a pattern. A single data point that has never been replicated, never appeared in peer-reviewed form, and has sat largely unexamined for over 15 years. This is the part the records don't explain. The tidy one population consensus from a moment ago doesn't collapse because of this single result. One sample can't overturn a whole population history. But it does something almost more unsettling. It proves that somewhere in this population's ancestry, there is at least one thread that has never been traced back to its actual source. And the R7 anomaly isn't standing alone. Autosomal data, the broader genetic material inherited from both parents, not just one line, shows Tutsi populations carrying roughly 3 times more Nilo-Saharan genetic influence, about 14.9%, compared to about 4.3% in Hutu populations. Some researchers connect that specifically to a pastoralist migratory history. Tishkoff and colleagues in a 2009 study found combined Hutu-Tutsi samples predominantly Bantu overall, but with a notable 17.7% Afro-Asiatic genetic component running through the combined dataset. Earlier still, Escoffier and colleagues back in 1987 concluded that Tutsi and the related Hema population were, despite living surrounded by Bantu-speaking neighbors, genetically closer to Cushitic and Ethio-Semitic populations of the Horn of Africa. A 2004 study by Luis and colleagues examining biallelic genetic markers across many African countries found a statistically significant genetic difference between Tutsi and Hutu, though the same researchers were careful to note the overall size of that difference was not large. It isn't only DNA sequencing. Sickle cell trait, a genetic adaptation shaped by generations of exposure to malaria, turned up in Rwandan Hutu populations at rates comparable to their neighbors. In Rwandan Tutsi populations, it was almost entirely absent. Different exposure, different history. Then there's the physical data that fed a century of colonial mythology before any of this DNA testing existed. A 1987 textbook recording average Tutsi male height at 1.79 meters, tall enough that it became, on its own, a supposed marker of racial difference for European observers 100 years earlier. Every single one of these numbers, the Nilo-Saharan percentage, the Cushitic genetic affinity, the missing sickle cell trait, the height data, has been used, at one point or another, to argue exactly the same thing, that the Tutsi arrived in this region from somewhere else, comparatively recently, as outsiders rather than natives. That explanation has a name. It has close to a century of academic backing behind it. And it has a fatal flaw. The oldest and most infamous version of that explanation is what historians call the Hamitic hypothesis, and it did not begin as genetics. It began as colonial race theory. Historian René Lamarchand, in his widely cited study, Rwanda and Burundi, wrote that Tutsi physical features suggested ethnic affinities with the Gala, or Oromo, peoples of southern Ethiopia. Some anthropologists pushed the theory further still, proposing the Tutsi descended from the Falasha, the Ethiopian Jewish population, part of a much broader colonial-era assumption that any African group displaying political sophistication or centralized power must, by definition, trace its ancestry back to some outside, supposedly more advanced migration. The fullest version of the theory holds that a pastoralist population moved in from the Horn of Africa and established a monarchy in the Great Lakes region around the 16th century, laying the foundation for a rigid, hierarchical social order from that point forward. Scholar Bethwell Ogot, writing in the 1988 UNESCO General History of Africa, noted that the number of pastoralist people in the region increased sharply around the 15th century. cited by supporters of the theory as corroborating evidence. Belgian colonial administrators didn't just entertain this theory. They built a bureaucracy on top of it. Starting in 1933, identity cards issued across the territory formally fixed Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa as hereditary, printed, permanent categories, turning an unproven academic hypothesis into hard, state-enforced classification, stamped onto paper and carried in every pocket. Here is the fatal limitation. The Hamitic hypothesis wasn't built from genetic sequencing. Sequencing didn't exist yet. It was built from craniometry, nose-width measurement, and height charts, 19th and early 20th century racial pseudoscience that has been broadly discredited by mainstream anthropology for decades. Anthropologist Jean Hirno directly challenged the Ethiopian origin version of the theory using blood factor and archaeological evidence, arguing it simply didn't hold up. And the genuine genetic evidence, the real Nilo-Saharan percentages, the real Cushitic affinities from Beat 3, doesn't actually require a 16th century invasion to explain it. A shared genetic marker can just as easily be the residue of centuries of slow, ordinary, ongoing contact across an open region with no hard borders, no checkpoints, no reason for people not to move, marry, and mix for 1,000 years before anyone drew a line on a map. The Hamitic story explains every number in this file by assuming conquest, one dramatic, datable arrival. But there is a second explanation, far messier and far less convenient for anyone looking for a clean invasion narrative, that reads the exact same DNA and finds something that looks less like an arrival and more like a very long, very slow accumulation. No invasion, no single migration wave, just centuries of accumulation in a population that never stopped exchanging cattle, marriages, and genes across an open, connected landscape with no fences on it. The second theory doesn't come from an institution or a peer-reviewed department. It's worth saying so plainly. Population geneticist and science writer Razib Khan, working independently rather than through a university lab, argued that the genetic pattern more likely reflects gradual descent from a Nilotic population native to the Nile region, not a sudden 16th century conquest arriving out of Ethiopia. It's an argument built from the same raw genetic material as the invasion theory, just read in the opposite direction. Under this model, pastoralist herders and Bantu-speaking farmers across the Great Lakes region didn't arrive as separate armies at separate times. They intermixed continuously for 1,000 years or more, exchanging cattle, marriages, children, and genes the way neighboring populations everywhere eventually do. Tutsi and Hutu hardened into fixed, separate categories only recently, first informally, through the cattle wealth status shift called Kwihutura, and then, far more rigidly, through Belgian colonial administration. Here's the metaphor worth holding on to. Think of admixture, the genetic term for populations mixing over generations. Less like a wall being knocked down all at once, and more like two rivers running side by side for centuries, until the water can no longer be told apart. Under this reading, the 17.7% Afro-Asiatic genetic component that Tishkoff and colleagues identified in 2009 isn't evidence of a foreign ruling class parachuting in. It's residue. The accumulated trace of centuries of ordinary, two-way contact, long before any monarchy existed to enforce a hierarchy on top of it. There's supporting evidence. Lactose tolerance data collected as early as 1969 showed elevated milk sugar digestion among Tutsi and the closely related Hema population, a trait usually associated with desert-dwelling nomadic groups that have depended on milk as a survival food for very long stretches of time. That's not the signature of a fast invasion. That's the signature of slow, generational adaptation. Here is where the second mini-twist lands, and it's a heavy one. If these pastoralist-linked genetic markers really do reflect gradual, ancient adaptation rather than a dramatic 16th century arrival, then the entire colonial justification for treating Tutsi as recent foreigners, the exact justification later weaponized in the 1994 genocide propaganda, was built on a genetic misreading from the very beginning. Not a lie, necessarily, a misreading, but one with a body count. Critics of this more social reading push back, and their pushback matters. That 1987 figure, average Tutsi male height of 1.79 meters, could just as easily reflect nutrition tied to social class and cattle wealth as it could reflect ancestry. If colonial and pre-colonial society consistently fed its cattle-owning elite better, height differences would show up whether or not there was ever a genetic difference underneath them. Which means even the most cited physical proof from a century of argument might be measuring diet, not descent. And this theory, for all its explanatory power, still can't answer the one thing that's been sitting quietly since the cold open. It doesn't explain that single unpublished R7 result, the maternal marker from Rome that traces, on paper, to South Asia. Gradual regional admixture across the Great Lakes doesn't produce that. Nothing in either theory produces that. Two respectable, well-supported theories. One says invasion, one says accumulation. Neither accounts for the outlier sitting quietly in that Rome lab file. And neither explains what it might mean about a much older, much stranger set of human movements that nobody has ever fully mapped. The third possibility is the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud because it can't currently be tested. That Rwanda's population carries genuine traces of movement patterns originating far outside Africa altogether. That unpublished India-associated R7 finding from 2009 remains exactly what it was at the cold open, a single, unreplicated data point. It has never been confirmed in a published, peer-reviewed dataset. No follow-up study has ever gone looking for a second carrier. Researchers are careful to frame it as an open anomaly, not a discovery. The distinction matters, because an anomaly can mean almost anything, while a discovery has already been checked. What could actually explain one marker like that, sitting alone in Central Africa? Researchers have floated a few honest possibilities, none confirmed. Ancient Indian Ocean trade contact, reaching inland over centuries through intermediary populations along the East African coast. A rare, deeply buried lineage surviving from an ancestral split so old it predates most of the population movements this entire story has covered. Or, less romantically, simple lab contamination or sampling error, a possibility the original researchers themselves have never been able to rule out. Here's what makes the gap around this question so much larger than it should be. There are, as of the current published literature, no peer-reviewed genetic studies specifically examining Tutsi maternal lineages at any real scale. The Y chromosome data, the paternal line, is comparatively well mapped. The maternal line, the mitochondrial thread that would actually confirm or kill the R7 anomaly, is almost entirely unstudied. That absence is its own kind of evidence. For a population whose origin question fueled one of the 20th century's worst genocides, the genetic record remains thinner and more contested than for most comparable population groups anywhere on the continent. Some researchers have suggested, cautiously, without hard proof, that the intense political sensitivity around ethnic classification in Rwanda since 1994, where the government actively discourages the very idea of separating people by ethnicity for research purposes, may have quietly suppressed the large-scale sampling that could resolve this either way. That's a plausible explanation. It is not a confirmed one. The honest scientific position, stated without hedging the hedge, the data that exists is fragmentary, occasionally contradictory, and on the maternal line specifically, almost non-existent. To understand why that gap matters as much as it does, you have to stand where this argument first turned from an academic dispute into something that could kill people. Picture a colonial registration office in Rwanda, 1933. You're standing in line with your neighbors, people you've farmed beside, worshipped beside, possibly intermarried with for generations. Belgian administrators are formally issuing identity cards, permanently fixing every person present into one of three printed categories: Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. Days earlier, in the world you actually lived in, that boundary could still shift with your cattle herd. Today, it can't. A colonial official measures skulls and noses with metal calipers, cross-referencing the results against textbook Hamitic racial theory before writing down your designation. Your grandfather moved between categories once in his lifetime, through cattle wealth alone. You will not get that chance. From this office forward, the label is hereditary. It's printed. It travels with you. You don't know yet what this card will become. You don't know it will outlive Belgian colonial rule by decades. You don't know it will still be checked at roadblocks 61 years later, in 1994, deciding in seconds who lives and who doesn't. You certainly don't know that geneticists 100 years from this moment will still be pulling blood samples apart, trying to determine whether the distinction being written down right now ever had a solid biological basis at all. The pen moves. The category is assigned. A social hierarchy that had been fluid, permeable, and negotiable for centuries becomes fixed. First in ink, then in law, then, eventually, in bodies. That card was built on a theory. The theory was built on measurements. And the measurements, it turns out, were measuring the wrong thing. Here is the reframe every theory in this story has been circling without ever quite landing on. Stated as plainly as the genetics allows, There is little to no detectable genetic differentiation between Hutu and Tutsi populations at the broad population level. The social categories were, and are, real and consequential. The underlying gene pools underneath those categories largely overlap. What the genetic literature suggests happened next is the part that reframes everything. Colonial-era social sorting, favoring taller, wealthier cattle owners as Tutsi, generation after generation, likely took small, pre-existing biological differences and reinforced them, amplified them, hardened them into something that looked, by the 20th century, like a clean racial line. In effect, the sorting manufactured a taller elite and a shorter underclass with only a loose relationship to the actual ancestral gene pools that had existed a few centuries earlier. That means the invasion theory and the accumulation theory were both partly right and both incomplete. Small ancestral genetic differences really did exist. The Nilo-Saharan component, the Afro-Asiatic signal, the missing sickle cell trait, the lactose tolerance pattern, none of that was invented, but colonial classification, not ancient migration, is what took a soft gradient and turned it into a hard, weaponizable line. Fixed, then justified. The Belgian administrators standing in that 1933 registration office weren't simply recording a pre-existing racial reality the way they believed they were. Their identity card system, their height charts, their nose calipers actively hardened a fluid, overlapping, historically negotiable population gradient into the rigid binary that would later make genocide administratively possible. A system efficient enough that a card, checked in seconds at a roadblock, could decide a life. Even the most frequently cited physical evidence, that 1.79-meter average Tutsi height, still sits in genuine, unresolved dispute between researchers who read it as ancestral signal and researchers who read it as a nutritional artifact of social class. The proof was never as solid as either side of the century-long argument claimed it was. And the one true anomaly in this entire file, that single R7 mitochondrial marker from a Tutsi blood sample tested in a Rome lab, still sits outside every framework offered so far. Not the invasion theory, not the accumulation theory. 15 years on, it remains uninvestigated. There's a researcher's daughter, now grown, who keeps a photocopy of her grandfather's old 1933 identity card in a folder with his other papers. Not because the label on it was ever true in any biological sense, researchers are now fairly confident, but because it was the document that decided which side of a roadblock he needed to stand on 6 decades later. It was a piece of paper, she has been known to say. It decided who my father buried and who he didn't. That's not a genetic finding. It's the human weight the genetic findings are still trying to catch up to. The deepest irony sits right there, unresolved. A genocide fought over the question of who truly belonged was fought, in the end, over a genetic distinction so small that, decades of sequencing later, scientists still cannot agree it constitutes a real ancestral split at all. The question was never really about DNA. DNA just happened to be sitting there, waiting to be misread by whoever needed an answer first. Rwanda's story isn't unique. That's the part that should unsettle you most. Around the world, colonial and pre-colonial administrators have done some version of this same thing over and over, taking a soft, overlapping human genetic gradient and administratively converting it into a hard racial or ethnic category with real legal teeth. Rwanda is simply the case where the human cost of that conversion has been documented most starkly, most recently, and most completely. The scientific record does show real, measurable genetic differences between many neighboring human populations across the world. That much is true and not in dispute. But different and foreign invader have never been the same claim. And history keeps showing, in case after case, how easily the first gets mistaken for the second, the moment a state needs a justification for something it has already decided to do. After 1994, Rwanda's government eliminated the legal ethnic categories entirely, replacing them with a single unified national identity. An attempt, administratively, to unmake what an earlier administration had spent 61 years making permanent. The unpublished R7 anomaly is still there, unexplained. The maternal lineages are still almost entirely unmapped. The disputed height data still splits researchers down the middle. None of it has closed. If anything, each new study seems to widen the file rather than settle it. What the data does confirm, without much room for argument, is this. The line drawn in that 1933 registration office was thinner, more contested, and more artificial than the century of violence built on top of it ever admitted it could be. 2 rivers, running side by side for centuries, close enough in color and current that no honest scientist today can draw a clean border between them. And yet a line was drawn anyway, in ink, then in law, then in bodies. The Rwandan were never who that ink card said they were, and the truth DNA reveals isn't an answer. It's a set of rivers still running together, closer than anyone with a stamp and a caliper ever wanted to admit.